25-year-old Elena Sullivan stands alone in her cabin. For 3 years, she's lived in isolation, ever since her parents died in a mysterious fire. But Elena has a secret. She hears voices from the earth, whispers in a language she doesn't understand, dreams of flames and ancient words. Tonight, everything changes. Two Apache warriors emerge from the blizzard. They save her from wolves. But these aren't strangers. One of them is her father. Elena discovers her mother wasn't who she claimed to be. Her blood carries Apache heritage, and there's gold beneath her land. The town's powerful banker, Eleanor Winters, will kill anyone who stands in her way. She's already murdered Elena's parents. Now Elena must choose. Stand between two worlds that have always been enemies, or watch everything burn again. This is Echoes of Two Worlds, a story of identity betrayal and finding home in your own blood. Let's begin. Echoes of Two Worlds, the wind-carried voices tonight. Elena Sullivan pressed her palms against the frost-covered window, her breath clouding the glass as she strained to listen. Outside, the Montana winter raged with biblical fury, but beneath the howling storm she heard something else. Something that made her skin prickle with recognition she couldn't name. "You're losing your mind," she told herself, stepping back from the window. 3 years of isolation will do that to a person. The voices had started 6 months ago. Whispers in a language that felt familiar, yet foreign, drifting up from the earth itself when she worked in her small garden. At first, she'd dismissed them as tricks of the wind through the pine trees, but they'd grown stronger, more insistent, until even now in the depths of winter, when the ground lay frozen beneath 3 feet of snow, she could hear them calling. Elena wrapped her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved away from the window. The cabin felt impossibly small tonight, the walls pressing in like a coffin. She'd felt this way often since her parents' death 3 years ago, but tonight was different. Tonight, the restlessness in her bones matched the fury of the storm outside. She built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across the modest room. The photograph on the mantel caught the light, her parents James and Sarah Sullivan standing proud before this very cabin on their wedding day 26 years ago. Sarah's dark eyes seemed to follow Elena as she moved about the room as they always did. Those eyes that held secrets, Elena was only beginning to suspect. The nightmare came without warning. One moment Elena was stoking the fire, the next she was gasping awake in her chair, the poker clattering to the floor. In her dream, flames had consumed everything, the walls, the air, her parents' screams echoing as the cabin became a furnace. But it wasn't this cabin burning. It was somewhere else, someone else, and she had been both observer and participant, watching her own hands work desperately to save lives that slipped away like smoke. Elena's hands shook as she pressed them to her temples. The nightmare came every few weeks now, always the same, and always leaving her with the taste of ash and the sound of voices speaking words she almost understood. Words in Apache. The thought struck her like a physical blow. She'd never consciously learned any native language, yet somehow she knew that's what the dream voices spoke. Just as she knew the whispers from the earth carried the same cadence, the same mysterious familiarity. A new sound cut through her confusion, the howl of wolves closer than they'd ever come before. Elena grabbed her father's Winchester rifle from above the mantel, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. The wolves had been growing bolder as the winter deepened, driven by hunger to venture closer to human habitation. She moved to the window again, rifle ready, and peered into the swirling, white darkness. At first, she saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then at the edge of the tree line, yellow eyes reflected the lamplight hanging by her door. Not one wolf, 3, no 4. The largest stepped forward, head lowered, muscles bunching to spring. Elena raised her rifle finger, finding the trigger. She'd killed wolves before when necessary, though it always left her feeling hollow. These were just animals trying to survive like herself. The rifle shot cracked through the night air. But Elena's finger hadn't moved. Confusion flooded her as the lead wolf collapsed mid-leap, blood staining the pristine snow. She spun toward the sound rifle still raised and saw two figures emerging from the blizzard like spirits materializing from the storm itself. Two men impossibly tall with broad shoulders and bronze skin approached on horseback. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of lives lived in harmony with the harsh landscape. Both wore their black hair, long strands of premature silver, threading through the darkness like veins of precious metal. Apache, The word formed in Elena's mind as fear, and something else, recognition, surged through her veins. She'd heard the stories in town, warnings passed in hushed voices about the savage tribes that still roamed the territory. Yet what struck her now wasn't ferocity, but dignity, something ancient and powerful in their bearing that made the wolves' wildness seem tame by comparison. The older man, his face marked by deep scars that cut across weathered features, dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size. He approached slowly, hands visible, stopping at a respectful distance. "Wolf was hunting you," he said, his English accented but clear. "Bad night to die alone." Elena kept the rifle steady, though her hands had begun to tremble, not from fear, she realized, but from something else entirely. Something that felt like coming home. "Bad night to be riding too," she managed. The second man dismounted, staying close to the horses. His movements were quieter than his companions', watchful eyes scanning their surroundings with the wariness of prey that had learned to hunt. When he spoke, his English was smoother, more cultured. "Storm came faster than expected. We need shelter until it passes." Elena's mind raced. 2 Apache men asking entry to her home. The town would have fresh gossip for months if they knew. But as she looked at them, really looked, she saw something that defied every story she'd been told. She saw exhaustion in their faces, the bone-deep weariness of men who had traveled far in search of something precious. And in the scarred man's eyes, she saw a grief that matched her own. "I am Chiton," he said, gesturing to his companion. "This is Keem." The names resonated in her chest like struck bells. She'd never heard them before yet. They felt familiar, like words she'd known in another life. 3 years of isolation pressed down on her. 3 years of empty rooms and conversations held only with ghosts. The wolf's blood spread wider on the snow, a stark reminder of what loneliness could cost. "Come in," she said, finally lowering the rifle slightly. "But your weapons stay by the door." Chiton nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and understanding. As they followed her inside, the cabin suddenly felt impossibly small, with their presence filling it, yet somehow more complete than it had been in years. "You can warm yourselves," Elena said, nodding toward the hearth where flames danced hungrily. They moved toward the fire with reverence, crouching before it as if greeting an old friend. Elena watched as they extended their large hands toward the warm shadows dancing across their faces. Chiton's scar ran from temple to jaw, white against his copper skin, a mark of survival rather than defeat. Keem's eyes seemed to absorb everything missing. Nothing, yet holding secrets he wasn't ready to share. As Elena ladled stew into bowls, she felt Chiton's gaze drift across the cabin, lingering on the photograph of her parents that sat on the mantel. Something in his expression shifted, too subtle to name, but unmistakable nonetheless. "You live alone here?" Keem asked, accepting the bowl with a slight nod of thanks. 3 years now," Elena replied, settling into her own chair. "Since my parents died. Hard life for woman alone." Chiton observed, his scarred face thoughtful. "Dangerous." Elena bristled slightly. "I can take care of myself." "Yes," Chiton said, surprising her. "Can see this, but some dangers cannot be fought with rifle." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Elena found herself studying his face for clues. What dangers, and why did she feel as though he knew something about her that she didn't know herself? That night, sleep evaded Elena entirely. She lay in her small bed behind a curtain, listening to the stranger's breathing and the storm's rage. Near dawn, she woke from a fitful doze, her nightgown damp with sweat despite the cold. The same dream again. Flames consuming walls around her, and strange words she couldn't understand spilling from her own lips. But this time, beyond the curtain, she heard a low murmur of voices speaking in the same language that haunted her sleep. Elena froze, straining to listen. The language of her dreams, the same rhythms, the same cadence. It flowed over her like water, and somewhere in her chest something stirred with recognition. When she emerged later, she found Chiton sitting by the window carving a small piece of wood with a knife that appeared and disappeared between his fingers with remarkable dexterity. "Your friend?" she asked, gesturing toward the door. "Checking horses," Chiton replied without looking up. "Storm still bad." Elena moved to the stove, stoking the fire beneath it. "You'll need to move on when it breaks." When she turned, she found his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, not with fear, but with something else. A sense of being truly seen for the first time in years. "You have nightmares," he stated simply. Elena stiffened. "I talk in my sleep." Yes. He resumed carving the knife, making soft scraping sounds against the wood. Old words, Apache words. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Elena's feet. That's not possible. Many things possible, Chiton said, his voice gentle but certain. Many things hidden, waiting for right time to be known. Before Elena could respond, the door swung open. Keem entered in a swirl of snow, shaking it from his hair, like a wolf shedding water. Storm getting worse, he announced. No traveling today. Elena felt trapped between relief and anxiety. As she moved to retrieve more firewood, a wave of dizziness washed over her. Shaitan was beside her instantly, his hand steadying her elbow with surprising gentleness. You sick? He asked, concern evident in his voice. Elena shook her head, but even as she did, fever began to rise in her body. The voices from her dreams seemed to whisper louder, and the room began to spin. By evening, Elena's fever raged. The cabin walls seemed to pulse and shift, and voices from her childhood echoed in her ears. Voices she'd forgotten she'd ever heard. Through the haze, she felt a cool cloth on her forehead and heard a deep voice singing softly a melody that pulled at something buried deep in her memory. Mother sang that, she whispered, unsure if she'd spoken aloud. The singing paused. What you say, my mother, that song, she sang it when I was very small. In her fever dream, Elena saw Chaitan's face transform, grief and shock washing over his weathered features before darkness claimed her completely. When consciousness returned, pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows. Elena's fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She pushed herself up to find Keem kneeling by the hearth, feeding small sticks into the fire. Chaitan was nowhere to be seen. You speak in sleep, Keem said without turning. Many words, Apache words. Elena shook her head, denying what she couldn't explain. I don't know any Apache language. Body remembers what mind forgets, Keem replied quietly. Mother teaches before words, before understanding. My mother was as white as I am, Elena said firmly, though something uncertain flickered within ear. Keem's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held knowledge he wasn't sharing. Chaitan found something under floor. Elena followed his gaze to where a floorboard had been pulled up near the wall, a hiding place she hadn't known existed. Within lay a small leather pouch, its surface adorned with intricate beadwork. What is that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Medicine bag, Keem explained. Apache healer's bag. Very old, Psika. Very sacred. Elena stood on shaky legs and moved toward it. What's it doing in my house? The door opened before Keem could answer. Chaitan entered, arms laden with firewood, his eyes meeting Elena's, then dropping to the medicine bag. Something unspoken passed between the two men. Who are you really? Elena demanded, a tremor in her voice. What do you want from me? Chaitan set the wood down carefully, then approached her with measured steps. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to her on his palm. A carved wooden bird, its wings folded as though at rest. Your mother had one like this, he said quietly. She carried it always. Elena stared at the carving memories surging through her mother's hands always in motion, whirring a small wooden object when she was anxious or sad. An object Elena had never seen clearly that disappeared when her mother noticed her watching. How would you know that? She whispered. Chaitan's gaze was steady, unflinching. Because I carved the one she carried. The world seemed to still around Elena, the cabin's walls pressing in as something fundamental shifted beneath her feet. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, in the space between heartbeats, everything changed. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the moment. Keem moved to the window, his body tensing. Someone comes, he said, his voice carrying warning. 3 riders. Elena forced herself back to the present danger, retrieving her rifle from beside the door. Peering through the frosted glass, she recognized the approaching riders despite the swirling snow. Dr. Marcus Webb led the small group, his medical bag visible even through the storm. Behind him rode 2 men Elena didn't recognize, rough-looking types with the bearing of hired guns rather than medical assistants. It's Dr. Webb, Elena told the men, though unease prickled at her spine. The town doctor, but I don't know why he'd bring others. She'd known Marcus Webb for 3 years, ever since he had arrived in Thornfield fresh from medical school back east. He'd tried desperately to save her parents the night of the fire, working over their smoke-damaged bodies until exhaustion forced him to stop. The failure had marked him carved lines of guilt into his young face that had never quite faded. Stay back from the windows, Elena instructed Chayton and Keem as Webb's knock echoed through the cabin. She opened the door just enough to see his face, keeping the rifle visible but lowered. Webb's usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes wide with what looked like panic. "Elena, thank God you're alive," he said, his breath clouding in the cold air. "I've been worried sick. The storm, I saw smoke from your chimney and had to check." Something in his tone didn't ring true. In 3 years, Webb had never made house calls during severe weather, and he'd certainly never brought armed companions. "I'm fine, Marcus," Elena replied carefully, "though I'm curious why you felt the need for an escort." Webb's eyes flickered past her, trying to see into the cabin. "There have been reports of Apache raiders in the area. Dangerous men. I couldn't risk traveling alone." Elena felt Chayton and Keem's presence behind her, silent as shadows, but ready for violence if necessary. "I haven't seen any raiders." "Elena," Webb's voice dropped to an urgent whisper, "I need to tell you something about your parents. About the fire, I've discovered things." One of his companions, a man with cold eyes and gun-worn hands, stepped forward. "Doc, we don't have time for social calls." Webb shot the man a sharp look, then turned back to Elena. "May I come in? What I have to say, it's not safe to discuss in the open." Elena hesitated. Webb had been kind to her in the years since her parents' death, but something felt wrong about this visit. The timing, the companions, the barely controlled panic in his voice. "Perhaps when the storm passes," she said diplomatically. "Elena, please." Webb's voice cracked with desperation. "They know you have guests. They know about the Apache men. You're in terrible danger." The words sent ice through Elena's veins. How could Webb know about Chayton and Keem unless he'd been watching her cabin? Unless this wasn't the medical emergency he'd claimed. "I think you should leave," Elena said, raising her rifle slightly. The second gunman's hand moved to his holster, but Webb quickly raised his hand in a stopping gesture. "Elena, listen to me," Webb said urgently. "My Aunt Eleanor Winters, she's behind this. Behind everything, the land claims, the mining rights, even your parents' death. I've been gathering evidence, but she knows. She sent these men to—" A gunshot cracked through the storm, and Webb staggered, blood blooming across his white shirt. The gunman who'd fired lowered his weapon with professional calm. "Doc talked too much," he said to his companion. "Boss said he might." Elena raised her rifle, but before she could fire, Chayton appeared beside her. Moving with fluid violence, he launched himself from the doorway, tackling the shooter before the man could aim again. They crashed into the snow, grappling for the weapon. Keem materialized at Elena's other side, his own rifle retrieved from wherever they'd hidden their weapons, trained on the second gunman. "Drop it," Keem said quietly, his English accent completely gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The man hesitated, calculating odds. Chayton had gained control of the first gunman's weapon and now stood over the man's motionless form. Blood stained the snow, whether from Webb or the gunman, Elena couldn't tell. "Your choice," Chayton said, his scarred face impassive as he aimed the captured rifle at the remaining threat. The second gunman slowly placed his weapon in the snow and raised his hands. Elena rushed to where Webb lay crumpled in the snow, pressing her hands against the bleeding wound in his shoulder. His eyes found hers, clouded with pain, but still urgent. "Eleanor Winters," he gasped. "My aunt, she killed your parents. The gold, she wants the gold." "What gold?" Elena demanded, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "Under your land," Webb whispered. "She's been buying up properties, murdering anyone who won't sell. The Apache reservation. It's in her way." Elena's mind reeled. Eleanor Winters owned the bank in Thornfield, one of the wealthiest women in the territory. The idea that she was capable of murder seemed impossible, yet Webb's desperate certainty was compelling. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked. Webb's hand found hers, his grip weak but insistent. "Because she's my family and I won't be part of this anymore. The guilt, it's been eating me alive." Chayton approached, having secured both gunmen. "We need to move him inside, bleeding bad." Together they carried Webb into the cabin, Elena's medical knowledge learned from her mother's old books taking over. As she worked to clean and bandage the wound, Webb continued his confession in broken whispers. "She has men everywhere. Sheriff Reed, half the territorial officials. When she learned about the Apache mineral rights, when she discovered your mother's real heritage." Webb's eyes found Elena's. "Did you know about your mother?" Elena's hand stilled on the bandage. What about my mother? She wasn't who you think she was, Webb said weakly. Eleanor's been investigating your family for months. Your mother, Sarah, wasn't just white. She was half Apache. And according to the old treaties, that means the mineral rights could revert to the tribe. Keem finished, his voice heavy with understanding. Elena sat back on her heels, the world tilting again. First the medicine bay, then Shaitan's knowledge of her mother, now this. How many secrets had her parents kept? How much of her life had been built on carefully constructed lies? The evidence, Webb whispered urgently. I hid it in my medical bag. Documents, letters, proof of what Eleanor's done. You have to get it to the territorial marshal before. His words were cut off by the sound of more horses approaching through the storm. Many horses this time riding hard despite the weather. Shaitan moved to the window, his expression grim. Sheriff comes, many men with him. Elena felt the walls closing in, the wounded doctor on her floor. Two Apache men who might or might not be telling her the truth, and now the law arriving in force. Outside, she could hear Sheriff Reed's voice calling over the wind. Miss Sullivan, this is Sheriff Reed. We know you're harboring dangerous fugitives. Come out peacefully, and no one needs to get hurt. Elena looked at Chayton and Keem, these strangers who had saved her life and possibly changed it forever. In Chaitan's scarred face, she saw no fear, only a resignation that spoke of too many confrontations with white law, too many times when justice wore the wrong face. What do I do? She asked, surprised by her own question. When had she started trusting these men enough to ask their advice? Choose, Chayton said simply, between what you were told to believe and what your heart knows is true. Outside, Sheriff Reed was growing impatient. You have 1 minute, Miss Sullivan, then we're coming in. Elena looked at the medicine bag on the floor at Webb, bleeding on her table at the two Apache men who claimed to know secrets about her mother. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her family, about her place in the world was crumbling. But for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel alone. She picked up her rifle and moved toward the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. Whatever came next, whoever she really was, she would face it on her own terms. The storm raged outside, but inside, Elena Sullivan, daughter of mysteries, keeper of secrets, she was only beginning to understand the real awakening had just begun. Through the frosted window, she could see Sheriff Reed and his men forming a semicircle around her cabin, their weapons drawn against the swirling snow. Behind them, barely visible through the storm, other figures waited on horseback. Elena had the distinct feeling that her quiet life of isolation was about to end forever. She gripped her father's rifle tighter and prepared to discover exactly who Elena Sullivan really was. Elena opened the door slowly, her rifle visible but not raised in direct threat. The cold struck her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand steady in the doorway. Sheriff Malcolm Reed sat astride his horse, a man whose authority had never been questioned in Thornfield. His badge caught what little light filtered through the storm, and his weathered face showed no mercy beneath the brim of his hat. Miss Sullivan, Reed called, his voice carrying easily over the wind. Step away from the door and surrender the fugitives. What fugitives? Elena replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Reed's eyes narrowed. Don't play games with me, girl. We tracked 2 Apache raiders to your cabin. Dangerous men wanted for cattle rustling and murder. Elena felt Chayton and Keem's presence behind her, silent but ready. I see no raiders, Sheriff. Only men seeking shelter from the storm. Those men are wanted criminals, Reed insisted, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Harboring them makes you an accessory to their crimes. Through the swirling snow, Elena counted at least 6 armed men with Reed. Too many to fight even with Chayton and Keem's help. But Webb's words echoed in her mind, Eleanor Winters. She killed your parents. What crimes exactly? Elena asked, stalling for time while her mind raced. Reed's patience was clearly wearing thin. Murder of 3 settlers near Fort Mason. Theft of horses and cattle. These men are savage killers, Miss Sullivan. From behind her, Chayton's voice carried clearly through the storm. Lies. Reed's face darkened with fury. The murderer speaks. Come out here, Apache, and face justice. Your justice or Eleanor Winters' justice. Elena asked the words, leaving her mouth before she could stop them. The effect was immediate. Reed's expression shifted from anger to something more dangerous, calculation mixed with fear. What did you say? Dr. Webb told me everything before your men shot him. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. About the gold. About the land grabs, about what really happened to my parents. Reed's gaze flicked past her to where Webb presumably lay bleeding. Dr. Webb is a disturbed young man, Miss Sullivan. His guilt over failing to save your parents has clearly affected his mind. Has it? Elena stepped fully into the doorway, her rifle now clearly visible. Then why did your men shoot him when he started talking? For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the pines. Reed's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, and Elena realized that not all of them were comfortable with the situation. You're making a grave mistake, girl, Reed said finally. Step aside and we'll forget this conversation ever happened. No. The simple word hung in the air between them. Reed's hand moved closer to his gun. Elena! The voice came from behind the sheriff's men. A woman's voice, cultured and commanding. Eleanor Winters emerged from the storm on a black mare, her expensive coat in furs marking her as surely as a crown would mark royalty. Elena had seen the banker only a few times, usually from a distance, during her rare trips to town. Up close, Eleanor Winters was an impressive woman, tall, sharp-featured, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She projected an aura of absolute control that made even the harsh Montana winter seem to bend to her will. Mrs. Winters? Elena acknowledged, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Eleanor guided her horse closer, studying Elena with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. You've caused quite a stir, my dear. Harboring fugitives, assaulting peace officers. Her gaze flicked to the motionless form of the gunman in the snow. Possibly murder. Self-defense, Elena replied. Your men attacked Dr. Webb. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. My men, I think you're a confused child. I'm simply here as a concerned citizen, helping Sheriff Reed maintain order in our community. The woman's smooth denials might have been convincing if Elena hadn't seen the cold calculation in her eyes. This was the face of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, regardless of the cost to others. What do you want? Elena asked directly. Eleanor smiled, but the expression held no warmth. I want what's best for everyone involved. Your property sits on valuable mineral deposits, Elena. Deposits that could bring prosperity to the entire territory. But these complications make development impossible. Complications. The Apache mineral rights, for one thing. Eleanor's voice remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. Your mother's heritage creates certain legal ambiguities that my investors find troubling. Elena's blood chilled. So Webb had been telling the truth. They knew about her mother's Apache blood, about the old treaties that might protect the land from mining. My mother's heritage is none of your business, Elena said. Oh, but it is. Eleanor's smile widened. You see, dear, when someone of mixed blood inherits property that falls under tribal treaties, the law becomes murky. Investors don't like murky. They prefer clear ownership, uncomplicated by ancient claims and savage rights. The racial slur hit Elena like a slap, but she forced herself to remain calm. And if I refuse to sell, Eleanor shrugged delicately. Accidents happen in the wilderness. Fires spread quickly in dry timber. Sometimes entire families perish in such tragedies. The threat was barely veiled, and Elena understood with crystal clarity that she was looking at her parents' killer. Not directly, Eleanor would never dirty her own hands, but the woman who had ordered their deaths as casually as she might order new furniture. You murdered them, Elena whispered. I protected my investments, Eleanor corrected. Your father was a stubborn man who refused to see reason. Your mother, well, her mixed blood made her a liability from the beginning. Rage filled Elena's chest, hot and demanding. Her finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, and for a moment she imagined putting a bullet through Eleanor Winters' cold heart. But Chaitan's voice whispered behind her, choose, between what she'd been told to believe and what her heart knew was true, between the white world's justice and something deeper, older, more complete. Get off my land, Elena said. Eleanor's pleasant mask finally slipped, revealing the predator beneath. This isn't over, girl. You can't hide behind those savages forever. She turned her horse away, but Reed remained, his own anger barely contained. You're harboring wanted criminals, he said again. I have a duty. Your duty is to Eleanor Winters' bank account, Elena interrupted. How much is she paying you, Sheriff? Reed's face flushed with fury, but before he could respond, one of his deputies spoke up. Sheriff, maybe we should— Shut up, Johnson, Reed snapped. Then to Elena, you have until morning to surrender those men. After that, I come back with a federal warrant and enough men to burn you out. As the posse rode away into the storm, Elena remained in the doorway until their hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did she close the door and turn to face Chayton and Keem. Webb was conscious again, propped against the wall with his shoulder roughly bandaged. His face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes were alert. You shouldn't have confronted them, he said weakly. Eleanor doesn't make empty threats. Elena sank into a chair, the adrenaline leaving her shaky and exhausted. Tell me about my mother. Chayton moved to the fire, adding wood with methodical precision. Keem remained by the window, watching for any sign of the posse's return. Your mother, Webb began, then stopped, looking at Chayton uncertainly. Tell her, Chayton said quietly. Time for truth. Webb took a shaky breath. Eleanor's been researching your family for months, trying to find legal grounds to seize your property. She discovered that your mother, Sarah, wasn't fully white. According to the documents Eleanor found, Sarah was the daughter of an Apache medicine woman and a white trader named Thomas Green. Elena's heart skipped. Thomas Green, Eleanor's brother, Webb confirmed. He disappeared from the territory 25 years ago, around the time your mother left the reservation. Eleanor's always claimed he was murdered by Apache raiders, but the truth is more complicated. Chayton's carving knife had stilled in his hands. Something in his posture suggested he knew more about Thomas Green than he was revealing. Why didn't my mother tell me? Elena asked. Because she was protecting you, Webb said. A woman of mixed blood faces enough challenges in white society. A child of mixed blood faces even more. By presenting herself as fully white, marrying James Sullivan, she gave you a chance at a normal life. Elena thought of her childhood, of the strange dreams that had haunted her sleep, of the way she'd always felt incomplete. Normal, she repeated bitterly. She loved you, Chayton said suddenly, his scarred face turned toward the fire. Sarah loved you enough to sacrifice everything she was to give you what she thought you needed. There was something in his voice, a pain too deep and personal to be mere sympathy. Elena studied his profile, noting again the premature silver in his hair, the way he spoke of her mother with intimate knowledge. How do you know so much about her? Elena asked. Chayton's hands stilled on his carving. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken secrets and the crackling of the fire. Because, he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I loved her first. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She looked between Chayton and Keem, seeing new patterns in their faces, new possibilities in their long journey to her cabin. You courted my mother. Yes. Chayton set down his carving, turning to face her fully. Before she chose your father, before she left the tribe. Elena's mind raced. If Chayton had loved her mother, if he'd known her before she left the reservation. Are you saying that my father wasn't James Sullivan? The question hung in the air like smoke. Webb's eyes widened as he grasped the implications, and Keem turned from the window, his usually impassive face showing concern. Chayton met Elena's gaze steadily. James Sullivan was good man. He raised you with love, protected, you gave you his name. He was your father in all ways that matter. But not in blood, Elena pressed. Another long silence. Then Chayton nodded once, the gesture heavy with years of suppressed truth. Elena felt the world shift again, her entire understanding of herself crumbling and reforming. James Sullivan, the gentleman who had taught her to read, to shoot, to survive in the wilderness. He had known she wasn't his biological child and had loved her anyway. That's why Eleanor wants the land so badly, Webb said, his medical mind putting the pieces together. If Elena is Chayton's daughter, if she has direct Apache bloodline, the tribal treaty rights are ironclad. No court in the territory would rule against them. Elena looked at Chayton, her father, this scarred warrior who had searched for her across 25 years. The recognition she'd felt when she first saw him made sense now, as did his intimate knowledge of her mother's habits. Why didn't you come sooner? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Chayton's scarred hands clenched into fists. Was prisoner at Fort Madison for 15 years. False charges, but Apache man's word means nothing to White Court. When I finally freed Sarah was already dead. I thought you dead too. 15 years. Elena's heart ached for this man who had lost so much. Thomas Green? Keem spoke for the first time in hours. He was one who made false charges against Chayton. Said Chayton killed him in raid. Webb's eyes widen. But Thomas is alive. Eleanor's been receiving letters from him for years. That's how she knew about your mother's heritage, he told her. The betrayal cut deep. Elena's biological grandfather had not only abandoned her grandmother and mother, but had also destroyed Chayton's life with false accusations. Where is he now? Elena asked. Denver, Webb said. He's been living there under an assumed name, sending information to Eleanor about Apache land claims throughout the territory. Elena rose and moved to the window, staring out at the storm. So many lies, so many secrets. Her entire life had been built on carefully constructed deceptions, all designed to protect her from a truth that might have given her strength instead of shame. What happens now? She asked. Now we prepare, Chayton said, standing to join her at the window. Reed will return with more men. Eleanor will not give up easily. We could run, Keem suggested. Take Elena north across the border, start new life where Eleanor's reach cannot follow. No, Elena's voice was firm. I won't be driven from my home again, and I won't let Eleanor Winters profit from my parents' murder. Webb struggled to sit up straighter. The evidence I gathered, it's all in my medical bag. Bank records showing Eleanor's payments to Reed correspondence with mining companies, even a letter from Thomas Green detailing his arrangement with her. It's enough to destroy her, but only if we can get it to the right authorities. Federal Marshal, Chayton said. Only law higher than territorial corruption. Elena turned from the window, her decision crystallizing. Then we fight. We expose Eleanor for what she is, and we make sure the land remains under tribal protection. You could die, Webb warned. Eleanor has money, influence, armed men. What do we have? Elena looked at Chayton. This father she'd only just discovered and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than herself. We have the truth, she said simply. As if summoned by her words, a new sound cut through the storm, the approach of many horses moving fast despite the weather. But these weren't coming from the direction of town. Keem moved quickly to the window, then stepped back with something like wonder on his face. Apache riders, he announced. Full war party. Only Elena's heart stopped. Had the tribe come to reclaim Chayton and Keem? Were they about to be caught between Eleanor's hired guns and Apache warriors? But when the riders emerged from the storm, Elena saw something that changed everything. At their head rode an elderly Apache man, his face marked by the wisdom of many winters. Behind him came a dozen warriors, but also women and children, elders, and young men, not a war party, but a community. Chayton's breath caught. Nakai, he whispered. The medicine man. The old Apache dismounted with surprising agility and approached the cabin. When Elena opened the door, his dark eyes studied her with the intensity of one who sees beyond surface appearances. Daughter of Sarah, he said in accented but clear English. We have come to bring you home. Elena's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. Home. You carry the blood of two worlds, Nakai continued. Apache blood, through your father, white blood, through your mother's upbringing. But blood alone does not make belonging. Kois makes belonging. He gestured to the people waiting in the storm, her people, if she chose to claim them. We know of the white woman's greed, Nakai said. We know of the gold beneath this land that rightfully belongs to the tribe. But we also know that some battles cannot be won with weapons alone. Elena looked past him to the assembled Apaches, seeing in their faces not the savage hostility she'd been taught to expect, but dignity, strength, and acceptance. They had come not to take her away, but to stand with her. What are you proposing? She asked. Nakai smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. We stand together, daughter of two worlds, Apache and white old ways, and new against those who would steal what is not theirs to take. Behind Elena, Webb struggled to his feet. I'll help too, he said, his voice growing stronger with resolve. I have money, medical training, connections Eleanor doesn't know about. I won't let my family's crimes go unanswered. Elena felt something shift inside her, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. For the first time in her life, she wasn't caught between two worlds, she was the bridge connecting them. Yes, she said the word, carrying the weight of destiny. We stand together. Nakai nodded approvingly, then looked past her to Chayton. Old friend, it is good to see you free. Chayton stepped forward, and Elena watched as the two men embraced like brothers. In that moment, she glimpsed the life her father had been denied, the community he'd been torn from. by lies and prejudice. "Elena," Webb said urgently, "there's something else. Something I didn't tell you about Thomas Green." Elena turned to him, bracing for another revelation. "He's coming here," Webb continued. "Eleanor sent for him 3 days ago. He should arrive tomorrow, assuming the storm clears." Elena's blood chilled. "Why?" "Because Eleanor needs him to testify that the tribal treaties were fraudulently obtained. With his testimony, she can break the Apache land claims and seize everything." Elena looked at Chetan, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. Tomorrow would bring not just Eleanor's return, but the man whose betrayal had shaped both their lives. "Then we'd better be ready," Elena said. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, and Elena could see stars appearing between the racing clouds. By morning, the weather would clear, and the final confrontation would begin. She touched the medicine bag at her waist, her grandmother's medicine bag filled with power she was only beginning to understand. Whatever came next, she would face it, not as Elena Sullivan, isolated and unsure, but as the daughter of Chetan and the inheritor of Sarah's bridge between worlds. The voices from the earth were calling again, but now Elena could finally understand what they were saying. They were calling her home. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold, the storm having exhausted itself in the night. Elena stood on her cabin porch watching the Apache make camp in the shelter of the pine grove. Their presence had transformed the lonely homestead into something approaching a village, and for the first time in years, Elena felt the stirring of hope. Webb was stronger this morning, his medical training having guided him through the worst of his injury. He sat by the fire, methodically cleaning his instruments while explaining Eleanor's network of corruption to Nakai and the other Apache leaders. "She controls the bank, which means she controls most of the credit in the territory," Webb was saying. "Sheriff Reed, Judge Morrison, even the territorial land commissioner, they're all in her debt one way or another." Nakai listened with the patience of one who had learned that understanding an enemy's strength was as important as understanding their weakness. "This woman has great power in your world," the medicine man observed. "But power built on lies is like a tree with rotted roots. Strong winds bring it down." Elena moved to join them, her father's rifle still within easy reach. She'd spent much of the night in conversation with Chetan, learning about her Apache heritage, about the grandmother she'd never known, about the traditions and responsibilities that came with her mixed blood. "Any sign of them?" Webb asked. Elena shook her head. "But they'll come. Eleanor doesn't make idle threats." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses carried on the still air. But these riders came from the south, not from Thornfield, but from the territorial capital. Keem appeared at Elena's shoulder, his hand resting on his rifle. 6 riders, moving careful like hunters. Elena squinted against the morning glare, trying to make out details. The lead rider wore a long coat that spoke of authority, and something metallic glinted on his chest. Federal Marshal, she realized with growing excitement. The riders approached slowly, hands visible, clearly not wanting to provoke a fight with the assembled Apache. The marshal was a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to difficult situations. "Miss Elena Sullivan," he called out when he was still 20 yards away. "I'm Elena Sullivan." The marshal dismounted, his movements careful and respectful. "Marshal James Patterson, Federal Territory of Montana. I received some disturbing reports about activities in this area." Elena's heart leaped. "From Dr. Webb," among others. Patterson's gaze took in the Apache camp, the evidence of recent violence in the Snow Webb's bandaged shoulder. "It seems we arrived just in time." Before Elena could respond, another group of horses appeared, this time from the direction of town. Elena's heart sank as she recognized Sheriff Reed leading a much larger posse than before. Eleanor Winters rode beside him, and behind them came at least 20 armed men. But it was the third rider that made Elena's blood run cold. A man in his 50s, well-dressed despite the rough journey, with features that reminded her uncomfortably of Eleanor Winters. Features that she realized with a shock also reminded her of her mother. Thomas Green, her grandfather, the man whose lies had destroyed Chetan's life. Marshal Patterson's jaw tightened as he took in the approaching force. "Sheriff Reed," he called out, "stand down. This is now a federal matter." Reed's posse slowed but didn't stop. Eleanor urged her horse forward, her cold eyes fixed on Elena with undisguised hatred. "Marshal Patterson," Eleanor said smoothly, "how good of you to come. I trust Dr. Webb has been filling your ears with his delusions about his poor aunt. Actually, Mrs. Winters, I'm here based on evidence provided by several sources, including your brother. Eleanor's mask of control slipped for just a moment, revealing surprise and fear. Beside her, Thomas Green's face had gone pale. My brother is dead, Eleanor said carefully, killed by Apache raiders 25 years ago. Is he? Patterson turned to address Thomas directly. Mr. Green, would you care to explain the letters you've been sending to the territorial governor? The ones detailing your sister's criminal activities? Elena's mind reeled. Thomas Green had been working against Eleanor, but Webb had said he was helping her. Thomas dismounted slowly, his movements those of a man carrying a great weight. When he looked at Elena, she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not the cold calculation she'd expected, but deep abiding shame. I've been a coward, Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. For 25 years I've been a coward. But seeing my granddaughter standing here, his voice broke slightly. I can't continue the lie. Eleanor's face went white with fury. Thomas, you fool, what are you doing? What I should have done years ago. Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. Marshal, this contains documented evidence of my sister's crimes going back decades. Land fraud, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder. He's lying, Eleanor snapped. He's been blackmailing me for years, threatening to expose family secrets unless I paid him. This is revenge because I finally cut him off. Marshal Patterson accepted the portfolio, but his attention was focused on the tension building between the two groups. Reed's men had their hands on their weapons, and the Apache warriors had begun to spread out in a defensive formation. Sheriff Reed, Patterson said firmly, I'm ordering you to stand down. I have federal warrants for both you and Mrs. Winters. Reed's face flushed with anger. You have no jurisdiction here, Marshal. This is territorial business. Murder is federal business when it crosses territorial lines, Patterson replied, and when it involves violations of federal treaties with native tribes. Elena felt the moment balancing on a knife's edge. Too many armed men went in, too much anger and greed and fear. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the clearing would become a battlefield. That's when Nakai stepped forward. The old medicine man moved with the dignity of one who had seen decades of conflict and had learned when to fight and when to speak. His presence seemed to calm the very air around him. I am Nakai of the Mountain Apache, he announced in English, clear enough for all to understand. I speak for my people in this matter. Eleanor's lips curled with disdain. No one asked you to speak, old man. The earth asked me to speak, Nakai replied simply. The earth that remembers all truth, all blood, spilled all lies told. He gestured to Elena. This woman carries the blood of my people and the blood of yours. She stands between worlds as her mother did before her. The gold beneath this land belongs to the Apache by treaty and by right, but we do not seek war to claim it. What do you seek? Marshal Patterson asked, clearly recognizing the importance of the moment. Justice, Nakai said. Punishment for those who shed innocent blood. Protection for this daughter of two worlds who would bridge what has been divided. Eleanor's control finally snapped completely. I won't listen to this savage nonsense. This land will be mine, with or without federal approval. She turned to Reed, her voice sharp with command. Sheriff, arrest these people for harboring fugitives and threatening a federal official. Reed hesitated, clearly recognizing that the situation had moved beyond his control. Several of his men were already edging backward, unwilling to fire on federal marshals. Sheriff, Patterson said calmly, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and accessory to murder. Surrender your weapon. For a moment, Elena thought Reed might comply. Then his hand flew to his gun and everything exploded into chaos. Reed's shot went wild, striking nothing but air. Chiton moved like lightning, tackling the sheriff before he could fire again. Around the clearing, men were drawing weapons, shouting orders, seeking cover. Elena found herself pressed against the cabin wall by Webb, who was shielding her with his own body despite his wound. Through the melee, she saw Eleanor spurring her horse toward the trees, trying to escape in the confusion. Stop her, Elena shouted, but her voice was lost in the sounds of conflict. That's when Elena felt it, the whisper from the earth, stronger than it had ever been before. The voices of her ancestors, her grandmother's medicine calling to her across the years. Without conscious thought, Elena broke away from Webb and ran after Eleanor's fleeing horse. She had no weapon, no plan, only the certainty that if Eleanor escaped now, the killing would never end. Elena's feet found paths through the snow that shouldn't have existed, shortcuts through the trees that seemed to open before her. Behind her, she could hear Chayton shouting her name, but she didn't stop. She emerged from the pines just as Eleanor's horse stumbled in a hidden snowdrift. The banker was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the deep snow. Elena approached slowly, her hands empty, but her eyes burning with righteous fury. Eleanor struggled to her feet, her expensive clothes torn and dirty. In her hand was a small derringer, probably hidden in her coat all along. "You little half-breed bitch," Eleanor snarled. "You've ruined everything." "I've exposed everything," Elena corrected. "The truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep you try to bury it." Eleanor raised the derringer with shaking hands. "I should have killed you with your parents." "Yes," Elena said quietly. "You should have, because now I know who I really am." Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, a rifle shot cracked through the forest. Eleanor spun and fell, clutching her shoulder. Behind Elena, Chayton emerged from the trees, his smoking rifle trained on the wounded woman. "No more killing," he said simply. "Justice, not vengeance." By the time they returned to the clearing, the brief battle was over. Reed lay unconscious in the snow, his skull creased by Keem's rifle butt. 3 of the posse members were wounded, but none seriously. The Apache had fought with remarkable restraint, seeking to disable rather than kill. Marshal Patterson stood over the captured sheriff, handcuffs glinting in the morning sun. "Mrs. Winters will survive," he said as Chayton and Elena approached with their prisoner. "As will Sheriff Reed. They'll stand trial for their crimes." Thomas Green approached Elena hesitantly, his face etched with decades of regret. "Granddaughter," he said softly, "I know I have no right to ask forgiveness." Elena studied this man who had caused so much pain through his weakness and cowardice. She thought of her grandmother, the medicine woman whose strength had passed down through the generations despite being diluted by betrayal. "You have a chance to make things right," she said finally. "Don't waste it." Thomas nodded, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I'll testify to everything. Every crime, every lie. I'll spend whatever years I have left making amends." As the prisoners were secured and the wounded tended, Elena found herself standing with Nakai and Chayton, looking out over the land that had caused so much conflict. "What happens now?" she asked. Nakai smiled, the expression peaceful despite the morning's violence. "Now you choose, daughter of 2 worlds. The gold beneath this land could bring great wealth to the tribe, but wealth alone does not heal the wounds between peoples." Elena understood. The old treaties gave the Apache claim to the mineral rights, but exercising those claims might only create new conflicts, new cycles of greed and violence. "There's another way," she said slowly. "A partnership. Apache wisdom guiding the mining profits shared between the tribe and the white community, with protections for the land itself." Chayton's scarred face showed surprise and pride. "You would give up great wealth for the chance of peace." "I would use whatever wealth comes to build bridges instead of walls," Elena replied, "the way my mother dreamed of doing." Webb approached his arm in a makeshift sling, but his eyes bright with possibility. "The territorial government would support such an arrangement, especially with my testimony about Eleanor's crimes. You could set a precedent for the entire territory." Elena looked around at the assembled people, Apache and white federal marshals and former enemies. In the morning light, she could see the possibility of something unprecedented, a true partnership between peoples who had known only conflict. "Then that's what we'll do," she decided. As the day progressed and the immediate crisis settled, Elena found herself in conversation with Thomas Green. The man who had abandoned her grandmother, who had destroyed Chayton's life with false accusations, was trying to explain 25 years of cowardice and regret. "I was young and frightened," he said. "When your grandmother told me she was carrying a child, I panicked. The idea of being tied to an Apache woman, of having a mixed-blood child. I was a coward." Elena felt anger and pity in equal measure. "So you ran away and let my mother grow up thinking her father was dead." "Worse," Thomas admitted. "When Chayton came looking for information about Sarah years later, I was afraid he'd expose my secret. So I made up the story about him attacking me, had him arrested on false charges." Chayton, overhearing, approached slowly. Elena tensed, expecting violence, but her father's face showed only sadness. 15 years of my life," Chayton said quietly. 15 years stolen because you were afraid of truth." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I know I can never repay that debt. but I can make sure the truth is known now." For a long moment, the two men studied each other, the warrior who had suffered and the coward who had caused that suffering. Then, to Elena's amazement, Chetan extended his hand. "Truth spoken now has power to heal," he said. "Past cannot be changed, but future can be different." As the sun climbed higher, warming the snow-covered clearing, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of family, of belonging to something larger than herself. She stood between her father and grandfather, looking out at the land that had been fought over and bled for, and saw not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be shared. Webb joined them, his recovery remarkable for someone who'd been shot less than 24 hours ago. "The federal marshals want to interview everyone involved," he said, "but Marshal Patterson believes the territorial governor will approve your partnership proposal." Elena nodded, then looked at her father. "Will you stay? Help me learn the Apache ways I never knew." Chetan's scarred face softened with emotion. "Nothing could take me away again, daughter." Thomas cleared his throat hesitantly. If there's a place for an old fool who's trying to make amends." Elena considered this man who had caused so much pain, but who was now genuinely seeking redemption. The Apache way, as Nakai had explained it, emphasized healing over punishment, restoration over revenge. "There's a place," she said finally, "but you'll have to earn it." As the day turned toward afternoon and the various groups began to disperse, Elena walked to the place where her parents were buried. The simple wooden crosses seemed inadequate markers for lives that had bridged worlds and suffered for the attempt. Webb approached quietly, his presence comforting rather than intrusive. "They would be proud," he said softly. Elena nodded, touching the medicine bag at her waist. "My mother tried to protect me by hiding what I was. But maybe the protection I needed wasn't from my heritage. It was from people like Eleanor, who would use that heritage against me." "And now?" Webb asked. Elena looked back toward the cabin where Chetan and Nakai were sharing stories with the Apache children who had come with the war party. She saw Thomas sitting alone by the fire, still struggling with his own demons, but finally facing them honestly. She saw the federal marshals preparing to escort their prisoners back to Helena for trial. "Now I use everything I am," Elena said. "Apache wisdom and white law, my mother's healing knowledge and my father's strength. I become the bridge she dreamed of building." Webb smiled, and Elena realized that somewhere in the chaos of the last day, she'd begun to see him not just as her parents' doctor, but as something more. A partner, perhaps, in the difficult work ahead. "It won't be easy," he warned. "There will be others like Eleanor, others who see profit in division and conflict. Then we'll face them together." Elena replied, the word "we" carrying implications that made her heart race. As evening approached, Elena found herself participating in her first Apache ceremony. Nakai had insisted on a ritual of thanksgiving and purification, something to mark the end of the old conflicts and the beginning of whatever came next. The ceremony was simple but profound. As the medicine man spoke words in the ancient language that Elena was finally beginning to understand, she felt the whispers from the earth growing stronger. But they were no longer desperate calls for justice. They were songs of welcome, voices of ancestors celebrating her return to the fullness of her heritage. When it was her turn to speak, Elena found words she hadn't known she possessed. "I am Elena, daughter of Chetan, granddaughter of the medicine woman whose spirit still guards this land. I am also Elena Sullivan, daughter of James and Sarah, inheritor of their dream of peace between peoples. I carry the blood of two worlds, and I choose to honor both." The words seemed to resonate in the gathering dusk, and Elena felt something settle in her chest, a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before. Later, as the Apache made their final preparations for the journey back to the reservation, Nakai approached Elena with a gift. It was a necklace of carved bone and silver, beautiful in its simplicity. "This belonged to your grandmother," he said. "She asked me to give it to her granddaughter when the time was right." Elena accepted the necklace with trembling hands. As she fastened it around her neck, she felt a warmth spread through her body. Not fever this time, but something deeper. A connection to all the women who had come before her, all the wisdom and strength that lived in her blood. "Thank you," she whispered. Nakai smiled. "Thank your grandmother's spirit. She has been waiting a long time to see her granddaughter come home." As the Apache departed the next morning, Elena stood with Chetan and Webb, watching them disappear into the forest. The clearing seemed empty without them, but not lonely. For the first time in years, Elena felt that she had enough family, enough purpose, enough hope for the future. What now? Webb asked, echoing the question that had become their refrain. Elena looked at the cabin that had sheltered her through 3 years of isolation, at the land that held both gold and graves, at the two men who represented different aspects of her future. Now we build, she said simply. We build the bridge my mother dreamed of, and we do it right this time. Thomas Green had stayed behind to help with the legal arrangements, and despite Elena's lingering anger, she found herself gradually warming to this grandfather who was finally trying to earn forgiveness. He had money and connections that could help establish the partnership she envisioned, and more importantly, he had knowledge of Eleanor's network that would be crucial in preventing future corruption. The territorial government is already talking about making this a model for other disputed lands, Thomas reported after returning from Helena with the federal marshals. Your arrangement could change how the whole territory handles native rights. Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on the document in her hands. A letter from the Apache Tribal Council formally recognizing her as a member of the tribe and appointing her as their representative in the mining partnership. It was more than legal recognition. It was acceptance belonging to the family she'd always felt was missing. There's something else, Thomas said hesitantly. Something I found among Eleanor's papers. He handed Elena another document, this one older and more carefully preserved. As she read it, her eyes widened with surprise. A letter from my mother, she said softly, written just before the fire. The letter was addressed to Thomas himself, a final attempt by Sarah to reach out to the father who had abandoned her. In it, she spoke of Elena's gifts, her ability to hear the voices of the earth, her potential to bridge the worlds that had torn their family apart. She knew, Elena realized. She knew about my abilities, about what I could become. She was preparing you, Thomas said quietly. Even when she hid your heritage, she was teaching you to be strong enough to reclaim it when the time came. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she read her mother's words of love and hope. Sarah had suffered for her mixed blood, had sacrificed her identity to protect her daughter, but she had never lost faith that Elena would eventually find her way home. She would be proud, Webb said, reading over Elena's shoulder. Yes, Elena agreed. She would. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the partnership Elena had envisioned began to take shape. The Apache provided traditional knowledge about sustainable mining practices, while the territorial government contributed legal framework and technical expertise. Elena found herself at the center of it all, translating between worlds, mediating disputes, using her unique heritage to bridge gaps that had seemed unbridgeable. The gold, when they finally began extracting it, proved to be abundant but not overwhelming. There was enough to bring prosperity to both the Apache reservation and the surrounding white communities, but not so much as to attract the kind of destructive greed that had motivated Eleanor Winters. Webb established a medical practice that served both communities. His guilt over his aunt's crimes transformed into dedication to healing. He and Elena grew closer as they worked together, their partnership deepening from professional to personal in ways that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Thomas proved to be an invaluable ally, his knowledge of territorial politics and his genuine remorse for past crimes making him an effective advocate for the Apache cause. Elena watched him slowly rebuild his relationship with Chaiton, the two men finding a way to move beyond the damage of the past. But it was with Chaiton himself that Elena experienced the deepest healing. The father she'd never known became her teacher, introducing her to the Apache ways of understanding the natural world, showing her how to use the gifts her grandmother had passed down through the blood. The earth speaks to those who remember how to listen, he explained during one of their walks through the forest. Your grandmother had this gift, and your mother too, though she was afraid to use it. Elena touched the medicine bag at her waist, feeling the power thrumming within it. I'm not afraid anymore. Good, Chaiton said, his scarred face proud. Fear is the enemy of wisdom. As summer arrived and the mining operation began in earnest, Elena often stood on her cabin porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the land that had cost so many so much. But instead of dwelling on the past's pain, she found herself looking toward the future's possibilities. The voices from the earth still whispered to her, but they spoke now of healing rather than seeking justice. They told stories of the old days when Apache and white traders worked together, when the land provided for all who treated it with respect. Webb joined her on the porch one evening, his presence no longer surprising but always welcome. Any regrets? He asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps. Elena considered the question seriously. 3 years ago, she had been alone, isolated, incomplete. Now she was part of something larger, a community that spanned two cultures, a family that honored both bloodlines, a future that held promise instead of just survival. No regrets, she said finally, only gratitude. For what? Elena smiled, thinking of her mother's hidden journal, her father's long search, the grandfather who had finally found courage, the medicine man who had recognized her heritage, even the enemies who had forced her to discover her strength. For the journey, she said. For learning that being caught between two worlds doesn't make you half of anything, it makes you a bridge. Webb took her hand, his touch warm and sure. And what does the bridge do now? Elena looked out at the land where Apache children played alongside white children, where miners and medicine men worked side by side, where her mother's dream was finally becoming reality. Now the bridge builds more bridges, she said, until the divide becomes connection and connection becomes healing. As night fell over the Montana Valley, Elena Sullivan, daughter of two worlds, heir to ancient wisdom, architect of new possibilities, felt the voices of the earth singing songs of peace. The wind no longer howled with fury but whispered with contentment, carrying the scent of pine and promise across the land that had finally learned to belong to all its children. In the distance, she could hear Chayton telling stories to the Apache children who often visited, now his deep voice weaving tales of heroes and healing. Behind her, through the cabin window, she could see Thomas carefully transcribing those stories, preserving them for future generations who would need to remember how enemies became family. And beside her, Webb's quiet presence reminded her that love like peace was something that could be built between unlikely people when they had the courage to see past old fears to new possibilities. The gold beneath the earth was valuable, but the connections above it were precious beyond measure. Elena had found not just her heritage, but her purpose to be the living proof that bridges could be stronger than walls, that healing could triumph over hatred, that the daughter of two worlds could become the foundation for one world that honored all its children. The whispers from the earth were silent now, their message finally heard and answered. Elena Sullivan was home at last, not in a place but in herself, complete and whole, and ready for whatever the future might bring. In the end, the greatest treasure had never been the gold at all. It had been the truth that set them all free. The end.